This is a postscript to the last round game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura from the SINQUEFIELD Cup. Magnus won an absolutely beautiful endgame, but I didn't have the time or energy, frankly, to analyse this game in enormous detail on the evening of that the game was played. It was already very, very late. So I'd like to go back and answer a couple of the questions that people have been asking on the channel. So let's return to this position. This is already move 62, but Magnus has made some progress on the king side by advancing his pawns here. But the position should still be a draw. Here is where Nakamura played a very rash move, g5, allowing h5. And we'll consider whether this is tenable in a second. But here it's quite clear that black should wait with king g6. And, well, as lots of people were saying, this should be a draw. But how and why is another matter. So let's look into this. And there are a couple of really beautiful variations, so just bear with me. First of all, if h5 check, then black will blockade with king g5. So let's go back. So g5, I think, is the only way that white can try and make progress. And now white has a clear threat to play king g4 and h5. So black has to step in with the king to block. Now there's a threat to take here. So white should take on f6. Now rook f6, I think, should lose just to rook a7, and with two split pawns, this should be winning for white. So pawn takes pawn, of course, is sensible, keeping the pawns together. Now king h3 is a kind of waiting move. Steps out of the g file, so there's no unfortunate check, and well, black is almost in a kind of Zugzwang in this position. Black has to make a compromise here. So you can see the rook is tied to defending two pawns, so whichever way the rook moves, then one of the pawns is on prise. Or if the king retreats, then that allows white's king in. Now black can probably still hold this position, but psychologically it's tricky to go backwards like that. But there is actually a really nice way to hold this position without too much difficulty. And that's if black gives up the a pawn like this. So rook takes pawn. And now black waits with the rook along the back rank. Could go to practically any square along the back rank. So if rook f7, then we can just play king g6 and the position would repeat itself. So rook a6 is a trickier way to attack this, because if the king steps back, then white's king steps forward, and this is already very dangerous. If I can get in h5 and king f5, then black is in trouble. But instead of going back, well, you can just play rook f8 to protect that pawn. In fact, you don't need to. I'll explain in a second. And now rook c6 is another kind of Zugzwang position. But as we'll see, black can survive this. It's only a problem if black thinks he has to keep hold of his pawns. So for example, here, again, if the king goes backwards, then king g4 is very dangerous. Or if the rook waits, then rook c8 is problematic, because then I can check the king away and come in with king g4. But in this position, after rook c6, in fact, black is still okay here. Rook g8 is a good move. It's a fantastic move, actually. It's a beautiful defense. White takes the pawn. There's really nothing better. And then rook g3 check using a stalemate defense. So king takes rook is stalemate straight away. So if the king goes back, now be careful, because king takes will lose to rook check. So we'll put the rook back. Now, if, let's say, rook f5 check, what happens? We take the pawn, rook takes pawn. So white is 2 pawns up, 2 connected passed pawns, but it's a draw because we have another stalemate trick. We've just shifted the position down a rank. King takes rook is stalemate again. So if the king comes back, well, let's wait like this. Black now has a threat to play king g3, and there's a threat of mate and to take the pawn. And white has absolutely nothing in this position. It's impossible for white to make progress. For example, if the king tries to run, then the king comes in, and we can actually take that pawn because rook check, and the rook is on prise. And there's really nothing else in this position. It's a dead draw. So absolutely fascinating defense. I mean, these kind of stalemate tricks are actually so common in rook and pawn endgames and king and pawn endgames as well. But this move of Hikaru's, g5, it's such an impatient move. He'd had enough of waiting for white to roll forward and wanted to fix the structure and make sure that white wasn't coming forward anymore. But after h5, now I'm not sure this position is lost, I don't think it is, but certainly it's much more problematic. Let's just move on a little bit and get to the crunch moment where Hikaru gave up the a pawn. So here he played a5. So people were asking, why on earth did he give up this pawn? Well, again, I think it's a kind of lack of patience, again, you know, pushing these pawns forward. I think in giving up this pawn, he wanted to simplify the task. He believed this endgame was a draw, and he just thought that, okay, I give up the pawn and I concentrate on just defense. But as we know, Magnus found an absolutely beautiful way to win this position, and it is definitely a win. So a5, yeah, that was a mistake. Why shouldn't he keep the pawn? Well, he should just wait here. And I've played against my computer from this position and tried various things. What I want to do is advance the king up the board to try and get in and take that pawn, but actually it's impossible to force the win of the a pawn. You might like to play this against your chess engine, if you like, and try to do it, but actually it's impossible to force an exchange of rooks, and it's impossible to win that a pawn. So although it's still very, very tricky, in fact the position is still a draw. But I think g5 is the first sign that Hikaru was basically running out of patience, because king g6 is much clearer. I hope that answers a couple of questions anyway. Thanks for watching.